When Jake Hollister found a nun collapsed in the Kansas prairie, her bare feet bleeding and her lips whispering 3 forbidden words, he thought he was saving a life. He didn't know he was about to expose a secret so dark it would tear apart everything his town believed in. But before I tell you those 3 words she whispered, you need to understand something. The sheriff knew what was happening. The town's most trusted priest was behind it. And Jake, he was about to become enemy number 1. If you want the full story of how one rancher brought down an entire corrupt system, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next will shock you. Kansas, summer of 1889. The heat stretched across the prairie like a living thing. Dust hung in the air, thick and unmoving. Jake Hollister, a 52-year-old cattle rancher, rode slowly across his land just west of Dodge City. The grass was brown. The sun was merciless. Then he saw something dark in the middle of the field. At first he thought it was a dead animal, maybe a deer. But as his horse moved closer, Jake pulled hard on the reins. It wasn't an animal. It was a woman, a young woman dressed in a black nun's habit, lying face down in the dirt. Jake jumped off his horse. He ran to her and dropped to his knees. Her feet were bare. They were cut, bloody, covered in dust. Her clothing smelled of sweat and dirt. Her skin was burning hot under his hand when he touched. Her wrist checked for a pulse. She was alive, barely. Her lips moved. Jake leaned closer. She whispered something so quietly he almost missed it. That is forbidden. He didn't understand. What was forbidden? His touch, her presence here, something else. Then he heard it, hooves, distant, but getting closer. Someone was coming. Jake looked down at the woman. Nuns didn't collapse alone in the middle of nowhere. Something had driven her out here. Something bad. He made his decision. He slid his arms under her body and lifted her carefully. She didn't resist. She had no strength left to resist anything. Whatever she was running from, Jake wasn't going to let them find her. Not yet. In the American frontier towns of the 1880s, the Catholic Church wasn't just a place of worship. It was the backbone of civilization itself. In places like Dodge City, Kansas, where lawlessness was common in government, reach was limited. The church provided structure. It provided order. It provided meaning. Priests baptized children, blessed marriages, and buried the dead. They ran schools, hospitals, and orphanages. They were mediators in disputes. They were counselors in crises. For many settlers, especially immigrants from Catholic countries in Europe, the church was the only institution they could trust in a violent, unpredictable land. This gave religious figures enormous power. Power over belief. Power over reputation. Power over salvation itself. Within the church, there was a strict hierarchy. Priests answered to bishops. Nuns answered to priests. Everyone answered to Rome. And at the bottom of this structure were women in religious orders. They had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They owned nothing. They had no legal independence. Many had been sent to convents as teenagers, cutting ties with their families completely. If a nun questioned a priest, she was questioning God's representative on earth. If she accused him of wrongdoing, she was committing a sin. Speaking against the church wasn't just socially dangerous, it was spiritually dangerous. It meant risking excommunication, eternal damnation, and complete social death throughout the 19th century. There were documented cases of abuse within religious institutions, but most victims never spoke. Those who did were rarely believed. The church investigated itself. Local authorities, often devout Catholics themselves, refused to intervene in church matters. For a woman like the one Jake found in that field, speaking the truth meant losing everything. Her community, her purpose, her identity, her very soul, according to everything she'd been taught. So when she whispered that is forbidden, she wasn't just describing a rule. She was describing a cage, and she had just broken out of it. Jake carried the young nun to his cabin, a simple wood structure 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. He gave her water. He cleaned her wounds. He let her rest. Her name was Sister Elise. She was 23 years old. She had been at the St. Mary's Mission in Dodge City for 4 years. For the first day, she barely spoke. She slept, woke in panic, then slept again. The kind of exhaustion that comes not just from physical collapse, but from psychological terror. On the second day, she began to talk. She told Jake about Father Edmund Whitlock, the head priest at the mission. To the town, he was a respected leader, devout, charitable, trusted, but behind the mission walls, Whitlock was running a different operation entirely. Elise had seen the ledgers. Donations sent for orphan care were being redirected. Money meant to feed children was going elsewhere. To saloons, to private accounts, to people who had nothing to do with the church. When she asked an older sister about the discrepancies, the woman warned her to stay quiet. A week later, that same sister disappeared. The official story was that she had been reassigned to another diocese, but Elise never saw any transfer papers. She never received a letter. The woman simply vanished. Then, Elise noticed a pattern. Other nuns who asked too many questions also left suddenly, always without warning, always without explanation. Sheriff Robert Collins, the town's law enforcement, was a regular visitor to the mission. He met privately with Whitlock. He never questioned the missing women. He never investigated the finances. In frontier towns, sheriffs often worked closely with church leaders, but this wasn't cooperation. This was protection. Whitlock began watching Elise closely. He asked where she slept, where she prayed, who she spoke to. He never made direct threats. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Elise realized she had two choices: stay silent and disappear, or run and risk everything. Throughout American history, institutions that demand unquestioning obedience have hidden terrible secrets. Orphanages, asylums, missions. When people are taught that questioning authority is a sin, abuse thrives in the silence. Elise chose to run, and in doing so, she became a threat to an entire system built on that silence. Jake Hollister was not a hero. He was a 52-year-old cattle rancher who had spent most of his adult life keeping his head down and minding his own business. In the late 1880s, that was how most men survived on the Kansas frontier. But Jake carried a weight that wouldn't let him stay silent this time. 3 years earlier, his wife had fallen ill with fever. He brought her to the only doctor in Dodge City, a man respected by the community. The doctor looked at her, then looked at Jake's worn boots and calloused hands. He quoted a price Jake couldn't afford. When Jake asked if there was any way to work out payment, the doctor refused. He turned them away. 2 days later, Jake's wife died in their cabin. Jake never reported it, never challenged it, never said a word. In frontier towns, you didn't question men with power and education. You'd accepted your place. And Jake had lived with that silence every day since. Now, sitting across from Elise, he saw the same choice in front of him. Stay quiet and let someone else disappear. Or stand up, knowing it would cost him everything. Sheriff Collins had the law on his side. Father Whitlock had moral authority. If Jake went against them publicly, he would become an outcast. Ranchers depended on community trust for business, for labor, for survival. Going to war with town leaders meant economic ruin. But Jake understood something that Elise couldn't fully grasp yet. She thought she was alone. She thought speaking out was a burden only she would carry. Jake knew better. Throughout history, evil doesn't thrive because of powerful men. It thrives because ordinary people stay silent. He made his decision. They were going back to Dodge City, together. And if the truth destroyed them both, at least Jake wouldn't have to live with that silence again. The ride back to Dodge City took 2 days. The Kansas prairie stretched endlessly in every direction. Golden grass moved like water in the wind. The sky was clear and blue. But for Elise, none of that beauty mattered. Her hands shook on the saddle. Her breathing came shallow and cliff. She was riding back toward the place that had nearly destroyed her. Jake had a simple strategy: expose the truth publicly before they could be silenced. In frontier towns, justice often came down to who told their story first and who had witnesses to back it up. If they went quietly to the sheriff's office, Collins could arrest them both and no one would ever know why. But if they walked straight into the town square in broad daylight, people would see, people would hear. And that made all the difference. On the morning of the second day, the rooftops of Dodge City appeared on the horizon. By 1889, Dodge City was no longer the wild cattle town it had been in the 1870s. The cattle trade had ended in 1885 when Kansas extended its quarantine line across the entire state. The town was working to shed its violent reputation and become respectable. Churches had been established throughout the 1870s and 1880s, with the Union Church built in 1874 serving all denominations before separate congregations formed. The Catholic mission sat near the center of town, a visible symbol of moral authority. As Jake and Elise rode down the main street, people stopped and stared. A nun who had disappeared days earlier was now returning with a rancher. Whispers spread. Quickly, Sheriff Collins stepped out from his office. He moved slowly into their path, hand resting near his gun belt. His smile was thin and confident. Then the door of the mission opened. Father Whitlock emerged, his face calm, his eyes cold. He looked directly at Elise. "There you are, child," he said smoothly. "Come along now. We'll settle all this inside." Elise stepped back. Her legs felt weak. This was the moment. Speak now, or lose everything forever. And Colin's hand drifted closer to his holster. The crowd grew larger. Townspeople stepped out of shops. Others stopped mid-conversation. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Elise's voice shook, but she forced the words out. "I'm not going inside. Not today. Not ever again." Silence fell over the street, and she spoke louder. "I saw the ledgers. I saw where the money went. Money meant for orphans. Money meant for the poor. It went somewhere else. And when I asked questions, the women who helped me disappeared." The crowd shifted. Some faces showed shock. Others showed doubt. A few looked angry at her for speaking. Father Whitlock raised his hands calmly. "Children say wild things when they're frightened," he said smoothly. "Come now, sister. Let us talk. In private." But before he could take another step, a voice called out from the crowd. "Father, you owe me 3 months on the mission's account." It was the storekeeper, a man named Harris. His jaw was tight. "Every time I ask, you tell me God will provide. Maybe this is God providing an answer." Another voice. A woman this time. "My daughter worked in the mission kitchen. One day she just stopped coming home. He told me she ran off." "But Father, were you lying to me too?" The crowd began to murmur. Once one person spoke, others found courage. Collins stepped forward, his hand dropping toward his gun. "Enough of this." He drew his weapon and aimed it at Jake. 2 ranch hands rushed forward and slammed into Collins' arm. The gun fired wildly, the bullet smacking into the brick above the mission door. People screamed. Some ducked. Others rushed toward the fight. In the chaos, Whitlock turned and tried to run back into the mission. He made it 3 steps before. The storekeeper and another man tackled him in the doorway. The struggle knocked the mission door wide open. Paper spilled from a cabinet. A metal box hit the floor and burst apart. Ledgers and rolled bills scattered across the entry like a wound opening. An old woman bent down and picked up a page. Her hands shook as she read aloud. "Money for orphan children. Sent to Sally's saloon, Dodge City." People rushed forward. They stared at the evidence laid out before them. Page after page. Names, numbers, payments that never reached the people they were meant for. Whitlock's calm mask cracked. He had no words left. Collins was grabbed by 3 men before he could hurt anyone else. And for the first time, the mission door stood open. The darkness inside was finally exposed to light. Sheriff Collins and Father Whitlock were taken into custody. But in 1889, Kansas, legal proceedings moved. Slowly, formal legal institutions were still developing across frontier territories, where vast distances and limited populations had delayed the establishment of reliable courts and enforcement systems. Both men would face trial, but the process would take months, maybe longer. The town of Dodge City entered a period of collective shame and confusion. Some people were angry. Angry they had been deceived. Angry they hadn't seen the signs sooner. But others refused to believe it. Cognitive dissonance set in. They had trusted Whitlock. They had confessed their sins to him. To accept his guilt meant accepting they had been deeply, personally betrayed. A few still defended him. "Father Whitlock is a good man," they said. "This must be a misunderstanding." Elise became a complicated figure. To some, she was a hero. To others, she was a troublemaker who had destroyed the town's peace. Some of the other sisters at the mission were grateful she had spoken. Others were terrified of what came next. Change is frightening, even when the old system was corrupt. Jake faced consequences too. Some men respected what he had done. Others resented him for interfering. He was an outsider who had brought chaos to their community. Throughout American history, stories like this were more often buried than exposed. Women who spoke against powerful men were dismissed, punished, or simply disappeared. The fact that Elise's story ended with any justice at all made it rare. But speaking the truth doesn't guarantee a happy ending. It only guarantees that silence won't win. When Elise whispered that is forbidden in that Kansas field, she wasn't talking about Jake's touch. She was talking about her voice. Throughout history, institutions have used the word forbidden as a tool of control. They take natural human responses, asking questions, protecting yourself, seeking help, and transform them into sins. Is how power protects itself. The first documented case of religious institutional cover-up dates back to 1629 in Rome, when Spanish priest Joseph Calasanz chose to protect an accused abuser rather than the children, setting a pattern that would repeat for centuries. From 2001 to 2010, the Holy See examined sex abuse cases involving about 3,000 priests, some dating back 50 years, revealing worldwide patterns of long-term abuse and systematic cover-ups by church hierarchy. The manipulation works because it weaponizes faith itself. Abusers in religious settings draw not only on positions of power and authority as adults, but also on assertions about God's will, the ultimate, unquestionable authority for religious adherents. Victims are taught that speaking out isn't just disobedience to a person, it's disobedience to God. This pattern isn't unique to one institution. It appears in cults, authoritarian governments, and abusive families. The psychology is the same. Make victims police themselves. Make them believe that their own protection is somehow wrong. This is why outsiders like Jake matter. He hadn't learned the same silence. He hadn't been trained to obey the same rules. The power of questioning what we're told not to question can break entire systems. Forbidden often protects the powerful, not the sacred. And once enough people understand that, the spell breaks. In the months that followed, Elise made a choice that surprised many. She stayed at the mission, while some expected her to leave. Religious life entirely after what she had endured, Elise understood something important. The corruption wasn't in the faith itself. It was in the men who had twisted it for their own purposes. She worked alongside the other sisters to rebuild what had been broken. The ledgers were corrected. The money finally went where it was meant to go. Orphans were fed. Buildings were repaired. Transparency became the new standard. Jake rode into town every Saturday evening. He would tie his horse to the same fence, post outside the mission, and wait quietly. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat together in the fading light. Their relationship wasn't rushed. It wasn't certain. But it was honest. For Elise, this was part of her healing. Learning to trust again. Learning that not all men were like Whitlock. Learning that speaking the truth hadn't destroyed hurt, had freed her. The town healed slowly. Some scars remained. Recovery is always slower and less dramatic than exposure. But the mission became something different, something real. And every Saturday, Jake was there, patient, steady, waiting. Every Saturday after that, Jake Hollister waited by the fence, at the edge of the Hendersons' property, patient, loyal, unhurried. He understood what Sarah needed most, wasn't rescue it, was time, and the knowledge that someone would still be there when she was ready. The bravest love doesn't demand, it doesn't rush, it simply refuses to look away. History is changed not by heroes, but by ordinary people who choose courage in a single moment. One voice matters, but only when others are willing to stand beside it, to amplify it, to refuse the comfortable silence that protects those in power. The systems that demanded Sarah's silence haven't disappeared. They've only become more sophisticated. Authority still hides behind closed doors. Communities still choose comfort over truth. And somewhere, right now, someone is being told that speaking would cause more harm than staying quiet. But we know better now. We recognize when forbidden is being used not to protect the vulnerable, but to shield the powerful. We understand that the greatest danger isn't disruption, it's complicity. We need more Jake Hollisters, more people who won't accept easy answers when something feels wrong. More neighbors who choose discomfort over denial. More ordinary citizens who understand that silence, in the face of harm, is never neutral. On the prairie, the sun sets gold and endless. Two figures finally walk toward each other across the grass, no longer separated by shame or fear. The touch of their hands is simple, human, free. What was forbidden wasn't the touch, it was the truth, and once spoken, it could never be taken back.